retaliate. They had a mentality of an eye for an eye, and it didn't necessarily have to be the person that committed the first crime. It was just whoever came next. There were a lot of problems result from the people going through these immigrants going through that would just shoot any Indian they could see on a trail, and that's what led to most of the trouble.
Before the settlers came in, the Indians thought they heard that they were coming, and the word that got to the people in the Cache Valley area, the Shoshone people, was that these are a different kind of people. They saw the overland travelers that were going towards California. They would just come through. But they said this group of people were different. They said they were riding in wagons that were covered, and these people had their children with them, and these people would sing. And so they knew that there was more than just some people just passing through, that these people were of a different kind of people. And I think that they saw that they were kind of a happy people, and so in dealing with them, I think there was more respect for these people because they were also of a religious nature. And for Shoshone people, religion or respect for what you have is important.
The true destiny of this valley would be determined by the permanent settlement of Latter-day Saint pioneers who endured great hardship from the long, cold winters, as first experienced in the attempt to pasture church cattle herds here in 1855, when because of the lush summer grass, a ranch headquarters was established here at what is now Wellsville. The cold weather and deep snow doomed that project when all but 420 head of the 2,000 head of cattle starved. Faith and determination prevailed, with guidance from prominent community leaders, including Peter Mon, Ezra T. Benson, Bishop Henry Ballard, Bishop Robert Daines, Captain James Willey of the ill-fated Hancock Company, Mariner W. Merrill, Moses Thatcher, and others.
Well, in 1855 and 56, Brigham Young sent some people to Cache Valley with the idea that they would farm or take care of lots of cattle here. He and Heber C. Kimball and some others sent their cattle with these settlers, and they found the valley so beautiful and fertile. There were lots of grasses growing here. In fact, that's why the Indians sometimes came here, is to harvest the seeds from the grasses, and these settlers harvested 700 acres of grass to feed their cattle in the winter. And Brigham Young was also looking for other places for the settlers to live. And they had thought, when they first came to Salt Lake City, that if you went north, you wouldn't be able to raise any more crops. And so the first settlers went to south, but in 1855, Brigham Young sent Peter Mon and some others from Tooele, who were British saints and looking for places to settle and to make a living. They came here in July and made an excursion throughout the valley, went back to Brigham Young and told him this was a nice place and they thought they could make a living here, and he gave them authorization to come here. They came in September and saw the valley in all of its September glory with the leaves changing, and Marianne Weston Mon said what a beautiful place this was, and they settled then in Mon's Fort, that's by the side of a stream which is present-day Wellsville.
Peter Mon was my great-grandfather. He asked for other families to come. So there were 4 other families and 2 hired men who came with them. So they got their families in their wagons and came to Cache Valley. So on September the 15th of 1856, they came down over the mountains and came into Wellsville and drove their wagons right by a small stream there at the south end of the valley. And they took their boxes off of their wagons, and they were living in the boxes while the men, Peter and his sons and the other families, began cutting the grass hay and piling it and getting logs out to build their cabins to be able to survive the winter. They lived as best they could, agriculturally and with their cattle, and of course they had the things that all farmers have, and chickens and all of the things that you have to survive. Peter lived with the group, and their cabins were built in a row, and they called it Mon's Fort. Mary Ann Weston Mon, his wife, records that for weeks at a time she had no place to sleep because of the new people coming into the valley where they would reside in Peter and Mary Ann's home, all over the floor and wherever they could place them. And so he would send them out to the various settlements.
In 1857, with all the events taking place in Utah in 1857, Johnston's army coming, Mountain Meadows Massacre, all those things, Brigham Young had called people out of these settlements, whether they were in San Bernardino or Cache Valley or the Lemhi Valley of Idaho, Carson Valley of Nevada. They were brought back into headquarters, preparing to either fight for their homes or do a mass migration somewhere again. And of course, they ended up settling that. But during that particular crisis, a division of the Nauvoo Legion out of Ogden was sent up through Cache Valley because they wanted to watch to make sure U.S. troops under Johnston weren't going to go that far north and come down. But the crisis was solved, and many of those people from Ogden and Weber County, when they came through here in 1857, said, wow, this is where we could move. And so the Mons and the other people moved back in, went to the north area of Mendon. Then almost everywhere that a creek or a river came down out of the East Mountains, they began settlements. Providence, Paradise, Hiram, Logan.
Many of the settlers who came here came through Sardine Canyon. It was known as Sardine Canyon at that time, but it was known as Brigham Canyon. And as they came out of the canyon, the whole valley is spread out before you in a kind of a panorama. And they saw a valley, especially if they came in the spring and early summer, where it was tremendously green compared to other parts of Utah. There was an abundance of water. There was the Logan River, there's the Bear River that runs through the valley, there's the Cub River that runs through the valley, there's the Blacksmith Fork River. And so there was what looked like ample water for this place, and there were trees and green things growing along these streams and these rivers, and there's sometimes the grass on the floor of the valley was as tall as a horse's stomach or even taller. And so you see an incredibly beautiful and fertile region. All of these saints needed places to settle, needed farmland, and so they, most of them were really quite pleased when they saw this valley and what it was like. I must say that there were a few that left after they had experienced a winter or two, but probably not as many as left the Bear Lake Valley after it was settled, which in some ways is an extension of Cache Valley and was part of this region.
One of the things that frightened people at first was the intensity of the winters. They knew the reputation that cattle couldn't survive, that it was very, very cold, that if you got an inversion, you could get down below zero or in the teens for months at a time. And so, you know, in the first few years, as people were living in dugouts and little cabins, it was pretty bad. I mean, you know, up in Bear Lake, they tell the story of not being able to get to the ground to bury people. And of course, in the pioneer times, infant mortality, mother death, influenza, and a lot of those diseases were devastating.
The settlers were not the only ones to experience hardship and suffering. While for the most part, the Native Americans and Mormon pioneers peacefully coexisted, tensions arose between them that rapidly grew into conflict.
You have to understand this. The Indians were hunters and gatherers. They went typically to areas where things grew. There were no fences. They weren't restricted from moving, and they could go where they wanted. They depended in Cache Valley a lot on the grasses that grew there because they produced seeds, and seeds were a major part of the Indians' diet. Now, it doesn't sound very good to us today, but back in those days, seeds were very, very important. And currants and other berries that grew along the streams. And when the pioneers came in, the first thing they did was take 2,000 or 3,000 head of cattle from Antelope Island to Cache Valley. And within a year, all of the grasses that the Indians depended on for food were eaten. And then they started putting up fences, dividing the land off, plowing, all of which were very foreign to Indians and which had a very disruptive effect on the Indian lifestyle. Typically, the pioneers settled on the land. They grazed their animals on the land, which destroyed the Indian food supply, number one. Secondly, they started to hunt the Indians' game that the Indians depended on, you know, for their meat supply. And of course, the pioneers had to live also, and so typically they would hunt in the mountains for the same animals that the Indians hunted for. And so the game became more rare as the years went. Occasionally the Shoshones would take a cow or two from a local farmer in Cache Valley. And they didn't really look at it as stealing, because in the Indian society, it's a society where people share. That's what kept the tribe vibrant and kept everyone alive. If you had something and your neighbor didn't, you would share with them. Sharing is a very important concept. And they would see, they're starving to death now because all of their game is gone. They would see the Mormons raising hundreds of head of cattle next door, and they thought it was only fair that they shared some of those cattle, not only because the pioneers had taken their game supply, but because sharing was such an important thing. They saw these people that had so much, and they thought they ought to be sharing the wealth.
As Latter-day Saint settlers began to move from the core in the Salt Lake Valley north, and eventually reached the Box Elder Valley and made exploration trips into Cache Valley in the 1850s, they found all of these bands of Shoshone really very willing to invite them in to share these wonderful mountain valleys with them. There was the expectation that there would be give and take, and that the Shoshone would help these settlers, and the settlers would, in return, help the Native Americans when times were tough. And it generally worked pretty well in those early years. We have some wonderful accounts of different Shoshone leaders and their followers teaching these early Mormons what foods you could eat in the Great Basin. The plants out here were totally different than you found in the Midwest or on the East Coast or in England. And how did you know what you could eat and what would kill you? And there were just so many positive exchanges in those early years. Sadly, as wonderful as these valleys are, they really couldn't support an agrarian society as well as a hunting-gathering culture. And so you started having some periodic episodes of hostility, some occasional robberies and and other problems that began to strain what had been a really good relationship.